all panel chat so that people get like a sense of who all are here and all of that.
Okay. So guys, we're at 92 attendees, so I think we can start.
Great.
Okay. Shani, are you ready? You want to turn your video on?
Give me a sec, and I think I should be good to go. Just trying to make sure I have everything I need.
Is my audio good? You happy with the audio? Cool.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
Shani, we're going to go live now, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All yours.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. This is Shalini here. Really excited to have you all with us here today. It is morning in the Bay Area, evening in India, so we're all, I think, recovering from multiple time zones. As a member of Agami, we're an organization that are looking and trying to catalyze ideas to solve huge challenges in law and justice. And one of the things that we've been particularly keen to do is to try and amplify voices that are doing interesting work in this space and to provide an opportunity for discussions and conversations to happen. As part of that, we are launching a new series called Bridges for Justice in order to foster these connections. And the aim and idea behind this is that there's so much interesting happening in the world that speaks to some of the experiences and possibilities that are happening in India. And what we're trying to understand is to see if there are connections and synergies that we can have in the space and to create an atmosphere where this is a possible collaboration and just a learning opportunity for what's been happening. I know we have a lot planned today, so I don't intend to take up too much time. I just wanted to quickly introduce our moderator. And with that, I'll turn over to him for today's session. Bilal, we are thrilled to have him here with us. Bilal Zaidi is the founder and executive director of our democracy.in. Our Democracy is a civic tech platform that enables fundraising for political and democratic causes. It's helped political candidates like Manish Sisodia, Atishi, Kanhaiya Kumar, Jignesh Mevani, and others contest elections using crowd-funded money. It's been at the forefront of democratic movements for citizenship and protection of democratic institutions. Bilal also spent more than a decade as a TV journalist, and we're really thrilled to have him with us today. Bilal, all yours.
Thank you so much, Shalini. This is a good start. And I believe we are closing in on 100 people on this webinar. So a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us here. Let me quickly introduce our main speaker, the person we're going to be interacting with. Amélie-Sophie Vavrovsky, I hope I got the pronunciation right. We get a couple of points of concession because we're Indians. We can have slightly different kind of pronunciations, so forgive me if we got it wrong there. She's the founder and CEO at Formally. This is the organization that we are going to be referring to again and again. We'll try to dig deeper and try and understand what this organization has really been able to break and what is it that we can actually learn from her experiences there. Of course, the idea of this organization is to simplify immigration applications. We'll also be digging deeper into that as well. She's a graduate student in international policy at Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. She's a graduate research assistant for the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, which means I will also get in touch with you after this call. Emily, so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us here. It's really early morning where you are. Let me just start with some very basic, obvious questions. Let's try and understand what Formally really does. At the onset, we understand that this is you're bringing in technology to make the job of application for asylums easier. Where did the idea really come from? What was your starting point? Take us through maybe some of the case studies as well, if you may have, on what really made you get onto this journey. We also believe that you yourself have been working not just as a policy person, but also somebody who's volunteered on the ground. So you had a you had a lay of the land, so to say.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be your first speaker for this awesome series. I think the work Agami is doing is super important, and I'm just really honored to be able to support that a little bit. So thank you so much for the warm welcome. So to start with formally, my background is mostly working on refugee rights. I'm from Austria originally, and I grew up there, and I think I saw the European refugee crisis unfold fully, and it really impacted me. And it impacted me especially as somebody who's from a country that has a deep history of xenophobia and racism. And I thought it was incredibly important to have that never again mentality and welcome people, right? And then when I saw rises in Islamophobia, I think my first instinct was to do two things: is to work with refugees directly and to also learn Arabic. So language is how I communicate with people, and I'm a huge language nerd. But by connecting and actually being in a learning position, I think that forged really easy and deep connections. In terms of how we get to forums, formally was created later. It was created after the asylum situation at the US border deteriorated. I was in the US back then. I was an undergrad at Brown University, and I had been doing a lot of work in policy, right? And it just seemed like traditional policy wouldn't solve this crisis and would be too slow to actually address the needs of people. And to give you some context, in the US, immigration applications are only available in English, even for asylum seekers. And the US government does not provide legal counsel or an attorney to represent you in court, even if you're a child. So there are actually 3-year-olds representing themselves in court in the US. So that struck me as unnecessary and cruel. So we had two problems to solve, right? One is the lack of legal representation. So how do we get more people represented? Right now, 86% of asylum seekers do not have legal representation, which is estimated to make them about 5 times more likely to be denied, regardless of how valid their case is. So from a justice perspective, that seems really wrong, right? And the other problem we need to solve is how do we serve those 86% with a tool that allows them to actually understand those forms. And again, a little bit of context. So these forms are really complex and spicked with legal terms that are sometimes undercover, right? So sometimes the form asks you, are you fluent in English? Which seems really innocuous, but it's really asking, are you willing to give up your right to have an interpreter present during your court proceedings? It's not asking that, but it's the implication, right? So if you check you're fluent in English, that is what you're signing up for. So what Formally is doing is trying to provide some context for these questions. We're not able to provide legal advice, which is why we work closely with attorneys and with law firms and legal rights organizations so they can actually provide that legal counsel. What we're able to do is just take a process that's really complex and help make it easier. So we provide translations so that people can fill it out in a language they're comfortable in. We also translate answers back, and we provide context, and we also streamline questions, right? So if you don't need to answer a question based on the previous answer, we can pass you through that.
We'll come to technology, Emily, in a bit. We'll go deeper. We'll also ask you some, we'll try to go deeper into how the interface really works, maybe some learnings there as well. Let me quickly also bring in, so it's important to also understand that while this webinar is happening, there's also an effort to bring in a community of people who could be using all the knowledge that we gain over the next hour or so. So we're really glad to have many other people, practitioners from within the Indian ecosystem who are joining us here. Let me quickly introduce some of them. We have Roshni Shankar, who's joining us from Migration and Asylum Project. So very directly relevant to the conversation we're going to have. It was formerly known as the ARA Legal Initiative. It's a refugee legal aid center based in New Delhi. It provides legal aid and counseling to asylum seekers and refugees. A very warm welcome, Roshni. Thank you so much for joining us on this chat today. We also have Aniket. Aniket runs the technology-enabled platform called Haq Darshak. The idea of the platform is to transform how Indian citizens, they learn about or apply for the various government benefit schemes that are there. So at various levels, the Indian governance system works at different levels. You have the parliamentary system right on top. You also have the state governments. You also have municipal or grassroots governance bodies as well. So you have a number of schemes that various bodies offer and citizens can avail. Thank you so much, Aniket, for being here with us. We also have Aditya from Legality. Legality, it's an e-signing and document workflow platform. They help businesses digitize, optimize, and automate documentation processes. And they do that by helping eliminate reliance on paperwork. So they've actually seen a growth of 8 to 10x kind of saving of time that helps their clients deploy solutions. A very warm welcome to you too, Aditya. Thank you so much for joining in. And as you can see, we have this is a very decent audience that we have, a very knowledgeable audience already working on a lot of products that are being used in the intersection between technology and civic abilities. My question to you, coming back to you, Emily, was a little deeper into how the platform really works. We understand part one is where you've reached on the product. So that's one part of what you do. The other part is the community. How do you find, first, how did you find these users? How do you find the people who are asylum seekers? How do you identify them? How do you get them? How do you get them to onboard? That's one. And two, as we can see, and like you explained, there's also a human intervention at some point eventually. There are lawyers also eventually coming in at final stages. So how does this ecosystem really work out? At what part of it is product? Where is the community of users? And then the lawyers who are onboarded on your platform?
Yeah, so I'm super excited to have all these other organizations here. We mostly get our products to our community through organizations, probably much like Roshni's organization, right? So we work with immigrant rights organizations and the US refugee rights organizations that provide legal assistance, that provide pro se workshops, and they are distributing the software to our users. So there's two ways our users could find us, right? One is they would find us online, and then we would encourage them to reach out to one of our partner organizations. And there's a couple of reasons we do that. It's to make sure that people, A, get a resource that is trustworthy, that they can actually trust and that has their best interest in mind. And also, in case that organization cannot actually take on their case, they can still say something like, here's an access code to Formally. This other organization is running a workshop. Why don't you give it a shot and see if an attorney can review it with you at this other organization, right? So it also builds a network of trustworthy organizations that refugees and asylum seekers can actually trust. I think there is a tough time finding good information. So that's the two ways our community is coming together and getting to use the product. And we think that's the only responsible way to distribute it, because we don't want to give people an idea that attorneys are not a necessary component of filing an asylum application, which is really complex and tough, especially right now.
You want to share a little more on what would be your onboarding process for these attorneys as they work with you? Is there a process, or is it just product driven? Any attorney could come and use it? Is there an offline process, or is it all online?
Yeah, so they reach out to us directly, or we reach out to them. Onboarding is really easy. We're designed to be a software that you don't have to learn. That's intentionally designed, right? So we're designed to be as easy to use as WhatsApp. So as opposed to other legal tech software or management software for cases, you don't have to actually learn how to use Formally. So you just log in and it's pretty straightforward. So our training for attorneys is very short. And for clients, sometimes we help with onboarding clients, but sometimes the organizations just do it. And the way it works is you just need to create a username and a password. That's very intentional, because most of the people we serve don't actually have email addresses. So we just create a very simple username and password, and they can log in and start filling out a form.
Wow, that's so good to hear. Okay, let's go a little deeper into the product, and then we'll go into the larger questions around policy. Just tell us a little more about the product. How many stages of development have you had? Is it a prototype you're working on, or are you satisfied with the product that you've reached so far? And maybe if you want to just give us a sense of how easy was it to develop it, or was it very product heavy on tech? Just give us a sense of where you've reached.
Yeah, I think the iteration really comes from attorney feedback and what their clients are saying. So that's how we iterate. The other thing is just like attorneys come up with like wish lists of features that they would like. Our task is then to filter and find out which ones to build first. One thing we're working on right now is, or we're actually deploying and testing right now, is a feature to auto-generate child and spouse forms. So if an applicant has children, we are able to just pre-populate most of their I-589, which is the application for asylum in the US, with the click of a button, which is huge time saver for attorneys. So that's one feature we're working on. We're also analyzing our dashboard and our interface and how to best guide people through the process A to Z. So from actually starting to like having them upload documents and evidence in a secure way to actually being able to interface. And something else we're thinking of building right now are things like working with other partner organizations to provide translation for documents, also through Formally, which right now is a really strenuous process because attorneys need to actually scan copies, send it out to an organization, and then the applicant needs to pick it up physically at a location, which right now is really dangerous. So that's another feature we're excited to build. But there's so many things we'd like to build. So I don't think development is ever done. We're gonna have to build more things, test more things, and sometimes software breaks, right? So that's like the other day we had to build a new asylum application within 24 hours because the old one expired. And they don't tell you when they expire sometimes. So
wow, that's fantastic. Okay, so a couple of questions now. We'll go a little deeper into, we'll also give you a sense of how the Indian ecosystem has been so far. So I was just discussing it with, a few people I was talking to Varun and others a little while earlier. So India itself had very similar issues. Recently we had a massive debate around citizenship. We've had one entire region in India, which is the northeastern part of India, where we've had a process of NRC, which is a citizenship register that was created to find out who are the citizens of India and who are the ones who may have come illegally into India. But the scale at which we were working was tremendous. I mean, even by the end of this long process, we still have close to 2 million people who've not been able to make it to the register. So that's the scale at which India has been operating. We've seen some organizations have tried to address that problem also through technology. And yet at the same time, we know that the struggle is really heavy. Give us a sense of how has your journey been in the US? Give us a sense of how you've been able to navigate through the political environment in the US. Give us a sense of the scale of the crisis that you've been dealing with so that we can also understand that, okay, this is the ecosystem we're working with.
Yeah, I think I'd like to start this answer with saying that technology is never a perfect or a clean fix and doesn't fix everything. I think the human component is really key. And even though we make our technology accessible, 3-year-olds are not going to be able to use it, right? So, and folks who cannot type cannot use it either. So we need to recognize that and we need to work with that. And while we're trying to make it as accessible as possible, we need to keep in mind that what we're doing is actually just increase the capacity for like attorneys' resources, right? So if the folks who can read but don't know international law can now fill out forms by themselves, that means there's more time for those tough cases. So I think I'd like to say that first, because I just want to make sure that people know that technology is not an easy policy fix. It can help, but it's not a magic wand that just makes all problems go away. In terms of the political environment, I mean, the crisis at the US border has been huge. There has been this new policy called the MPP. It's not that new anymore. It's a year old, which is called the Migrant Protection Protocol, which activists actually call the Migrant Persecution Protocol. It requires asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while they're waiting for their cases to be heard, which is against international legal standards. So that has precipitated a crisis at the border for sure. And I mean, I'm sure you've read some of the news of child and family separations. So yeah, the scale is pretty large, but I mean, I don't think it's at the scale of what you're dealing with in India. I think population size matters. So what I would just encourage you with this answer is to say, like, leverage your resources and see how we can get volunteers trained on the software so they can help out. I think software can just make it a little easier to lower the barrier to entry to the legal field, but it's not a magic wand.
Have you as an organization had to face any challenges politically because it's a sensitive issue that you're intervening in?
Yeah, not yet, honestly. I think the nice thing is that we're just working with working with partners, right? Like it really helps. They're used to having those partners advocate for immigrant rights. And yeah, I don't think we've personally faced any issues, but we are ready to, if there was a subpoena from the U.S. government to be ready for it. We don't actually have any data to give over, so that's how we're sort of preparing for the worst case scenario.
You want to go a little deeper into that? I mean, we promise you, most of us will try to keep the conversation within this room, but we just want to get a sense of what's the kind of security that you're trying to use. How is your data stored? Are your servers in the US? What are the kind of precautions you've taken on the security front?
Bilal, I love this question. You know, I work for the Digital Civil Society Lab and I work on surveillance research. So we're end-to-end encrypted. It's not sexy technology. It's like very straightforward end-to-end encryption. Like I said, we're giving up some things due to that, right? Like we can, for instance, not recover someone's password when it's lost, which is why we encourage to store it with your trusted attorney, right? But other than that, it's very straightforward. It's just not a beautiful solution that most tech companies choose. But yeah, we think about security in a pretty conservative way because it is people's most private and maybe most personal information. So we need to be really careful.
Okay, that's good to hear. I will ask one more question around policy, and then we'll try to bring in more voices within this room. Just give us a sense of where are you on the scale at which you've reached. Do you have any targets in terms of where you want to reach? And given the kind of crisis that you are handling, how long do you think it will take for you to scale to the optimum level?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question, right? Because our growth plans are pretty huge, right? We're really thinking about building, I call this like a securely encrypted digital passport that helps you navigate bureaucracy regardless of where you are. So in the US, that might mean forms to apply for healthcare or forms to apply for food stamps or to help you fight your eviction case, right? So there's so much that can be done, which is why we're called formally, which is we were having bigger dreams than just immigration. We are solving the asylum crisis right now, and I think it's important to be focused on it. I think especially right now, just finding ways to deliver digital legal aid to folks at the border is really key. It requires a lot of partnerships with other organizations because we need to, for instance, worry about building hardware labs so that people can actually use computers or have internet. So I mean, we have made a good dent into that, but we're definitely not done. And our plans are much larger in the future. And we hope to make more processes easy and accessible.
Yeah, I do have a few questions that may hopefully be coming in soon. There is a request for all the people in the audience to start using the Zoom question and answer feature. Others could also upvote the questions. So keep your questions coming in. We'll start taking your questions in a bit. I had one more question for you, Amélie, that's also come in. So essentially, we're also trying to understand how do we make the most of the ecosystem that we have? Are there any ideas on how you've been collaborating with other people in the same ecosystem? We like sitting here in India, we know there are some amazing legal organizations in the US. Like, for example, ACLU is an organization we keep hearing about. So lots of legal organizations also on the ground. What's the best way to collaborate? And possibly you could also give us examples in case you have from outside of the US, perhaps in other countries as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's huge and it's kind of difficult at first to start collaborating with organizations if you're like a student team and they haven't heard about you yet. So I think you need to build trust and that takes time. And I think legal tech is hard in that way is you need to get it right. You need to get it really right. You need to do a lot of testing and you need to rely heavily on your partnerships and relationship building. So I'm not going to sugarcoat that. That's a journey and you need to really get in touch and really try to understand what their needs are and how you can help them. So that's how we've been building partnerships. And I think now that we have partnered with some very large organizations, that process becomes easier, right? Because suddenly you can call up your friend at the ACLU and ask about the software, and if they've heard about it and used it, you're like, oh, okay, that's probably trustworthy. So I really encourage you to just reach out to those wonderful organizations within your country to build those partnerships, and also just listen what their needs are. And there is definitely not a one-fits-all solution. So just being mindful of their very specific needs, I think, is really helpful. In terms of outside of the US, we've gotten some requests from governments, which is super exciting to me, but some governments are like trying to streamline processes. Something to note, despite the fact that I am an advocate for immigrant and refugee rights, filling out a form correctly does not guarantee you a spot, right? So governments who just don't want to deal with forms being filled out incorrectly, that's actually a way to pitch it to your government, right? You're like, your immigration judges are going to make the decisions. We're just helping people understand and have a fair chance. And for you, it's minimizing going back and forth with forms that are incomplete or filled out incorrectly. So I think that's why we've gotten more government interest for this as well. And I encourage you to pitch it differently to different audiences, right? And have that versatility within your organization.
Nice. That's really fun. That's very challenging and fun. Okay, great. Let's bring in some of the partners that are here on this webinar. Can I request Roshni, if she has a question, to come in? Maybe she could also share her experience with the migration and asylum project. I think that could be a good bridge between the two conversations that we're having.
Hi, can you see me?
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay, let me start my video. Okay, okay, I don't know, I'm not able to start my video for some reason, but yeah, I'll just meanwhile just give you a context of the situation in India. For us, registration, which is essentially what Formally does, which is to register yourself as an asylum seeker, is it's not really been an issue for us because it's a very short process. And for the benefit of the audience, in India, the asylum determination is done by the UN agency, UNHCR. So we don't go to the government, which in a way is good because we have more flexibility when it comes to legal representation. So we are actually able to physically be present for registration, for the asylum interview, for follow-ups, for training between lawyers in UNHCR and our offices. And the other thing is whatever best practices that we have been able to execute in India, we've also been able to take it to other field offices regionally. The problem in India is more in terms of scale. In India and South Asia, I mean, just the sheer numbers, it's over 2.2 million now, especially with the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh. And as you know, because of the lockdown, the most important thing for us in terms of digital capability right now is more to do with the actual asylum interview. And registration is something which we've been doing electronically or over the phone because UNHCR doesn't really ask for very confidential information at the registration stage. But the problem is more with the actual asylum interviews, because these interviews go on for hours, sometimes days. They're extremely, extremely sensitive because you have claims from child soldiers from Somalia to, protesters from Syria to, I don't know, like single women from Afghanistan. So all these, the information is so sensitive that we can't even have a family member present in the interview. So we have to interview each person separately. We can't if there's a discrepancy in their statement, we can't confront them because that again could put their lives at risk. Essentially, the asylum interview is the most important interview of their lives. Till they finish that, they cannot access anything. They don't have a refugee card. They can't go to the government hospital. They can't put their children in government schools. So it is a matter of life and death in some situations, because if they get rejected, they get deported and then they face persecution. Now, UNHCR has recently, in fact, the reason I was so interested in this talk is because like 3 days ago, the UNHCR headquarters has allowed remote RSD for the first time in the history of UNHCR. And I think the last 3 days have been a lot of us lawyers from the US as well. I'm sure you work with Asylum Access and similar agencies across the world, trying to figure out what we can do, because simple things like education, language barriers, like is a big problem when you do RSD, which is refugee status determination remotely. Similarly, like even identification of the applicant, like we don't know if we're doing it remotely, we don't know whether it's the same person who you've registered or it could be somebody who looks like him. So right now we are thinking of, we have to rapidly set up a remote virtual courtroom, like a tribunal hearing. It has to be done immediately because there's so many vulnerable people who've been in lockdown for the last 2-3 months and haven't had access to asylum. And we need to figure out some kind of a face recognition technology or like a thumb imprint technology or something like that to verify whether it's the same person. We need to be able to patch in an interpreter, and we need to be able to patch in a lawyer in these processes. And we have a month to do that. So actually we're going to have to pilot something very quickly. And as you, with your experience, you'll know governments, and I mean, not governments so much, but UN agencies tend to be very late in adopting any kind of sort of technological change. But I think now we're all forced to do that. So I just wanted to know if you've come across any sort of ideas in this space, not with the registration form, which for us, like I said, in our context, is very straightforward. It's a 5-minute job for us, but more in terms of the interviews.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough question, and I'm not an expert on digital courtrooms yet, but I mean, I would love to think about some of these issues with you, especially considering that you are considering like facial recognition software, just again, in terms of data storage and privacy. I know there are a lot of concerns right now. I mean, there's contact tracing apps that are mandatory and increasingly, and FR technology is, again, very sensitive data and information. So perhaps what we can do offline is think about at least some best practices in terms of data privacy that would still ensure that you're actually talking to the person you're talking to. And then in terms of accessibility, there were also some things we could do to try to make it easier, right? There could be like voice commands. Yeah, I don't know. I would love to take this offline with you. I honestly need to think about it more. But I would love to think about this with you, and also maybe connect you to some colleagues who are experts on these things.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Let me
Thank you.
now toss it over to Aniket, if you're around and if you can hear us. Maybe you could just bring in a little more context on what Haq Darshak does, and maybe if you have any questions to ask, feel free to go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So Haq Darshak essentially, like you mentioned earlier in the introduction, helps citizens get access to government benefits, welfare benefits. So in India, there are more than 12,000 government welfare programs across states and center and municipal corporations. So a lot of these benefits, the essential issue is that people who are eligible for them, which are close to about 800 million, they are the ones who are not aware of all these programs because of the gap in literacy and access.
Yeah.
We are using we built our own technology platform where citizens can essentially put in their profile and then profile details and then match with the cloud in terms of what are they eligible for. So checking the eligibility, which is the screening. And then we have like a bunch of entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs on ground, community workers who we train, who ensure that the last mile access in terms of application and documentation is done. So right now, I think most of the challenges that we face, and like what earlier Emily was also mentioning, and then Roshni, I think a lot of the issues that we have are around when the citizen gets the benefit. There are a lot of times when the benefit stops. So in terms of a cash transfer, in terms of a pension, in terms of an entitlement, and then the cost to get in terms of the access to the benefit is lower, but the cost to fight the case or get the legal help to ensure that the access continues is in fact higher, to get the paralegal help, to get the ground help. So we are also trying to see that how we can connect with a lot of other ground agencies in bridging that gap. And currently, I think a lot of the other challenges are around data and profiles of the citizens, because a lot of migration is happening from urban to rural areas. So how do you ensure that the same person who was getting access in the urban areas now wants to get access to a different program in rural areas? So how do you ensure that they get enrolled in the different in another program? So that's primarily some of the challenges that we are looking at. So I mean, I would just put it to everyone on the panel that if there are any thoughts around this or similar experiences where you've used a technology or legal processes currently with COVID, especially around migration and access to these entitlements.
Yeah. Again, I'm not an expert, and I just want to preface that because I think answers need to be really context specific, and I don't have full context, but thanks for sharing that. That sounds like a really tough question. Something that comes to mind is just thinking about ways to maybe make simple questionnaires that determine eligibility, that applicants could like self-screen for some of those things, right? They could be like, oh, am I eligible for this? Or I moved. And for those specific screening things like chatbots are actually sometimes really effective. Sometimes, again, right, caveat, right? Depends on what the access to technology is. But those screening forms could probably also be administered offline, right? They could just be administered in paper format. Again, I would love to hear more. I think all these problems are really fascinating and complex probably, but again, would encourage to partner with like local stakeholders and see what the resources are and then start drafting from there, right? Like what's available? Okay, do we have tablets? Great, no. We don't have internet. Okay, so if we don't have internet, what can we use, right? So just thinking through those things, like does a target audience have smartphones? Like that was a huge question for us. It turns out that asylum seekers in the US and refugees around the world actually do have smartphones, right? But sometimes they don't have data. So if they don't have data, but they have smartphones, can we maybe install some like internet connection at specific hubs where we also have some volunteers helping with those screening processes? So those are just like some ideas to throw out there, but I encourage you to work and with those local stakeholders and see what's available and then actually design your solution from there. What I say about our startup is that I'm not really attached to our product. I'm like attached to solving a problem, right? And I think that's really the mindset that's probably important in order to find a solution that is appropriate and also to be flexible enough to iterate on that solution if it's not working.
Okay, great. That's good. Aniket, if I could just add a quick bit as well. So we had this recent instance in the national capital in Delhi where we had violence in the month of Feb. So there we had like the challenge was really huge. That we had a lot of people who were affected. One section were citizens of Delhi with ration cards. So they were all citizens of Delhi. But there were many people who were not even from Delhi. They were from outside of Delhi. They were living in that part of the city. They were directly affected by violence. And yet some of the schemes that the Delhi government could offer was only through the ration cards. They couldn't offer those remedies through to people who did not have a Delhi card. So that's where I think the civil society was roped in. And again, you do these collaborations, and perhaps I think that's the only way forward in the context that you're talking about. Of course, with so much of migration happening away from the cities, people going back to their hometowns, a lot of them may not even have the paperwork to avail some of the policies that are being built right now. So yeah, so I think it needs to be something of an intersection between the civil society and the government, and maybe something could be worked out there. Possibly we could take it offline as well. Let me quickly also bring in Aditya from Legality. Aditya, you want to just quickly give us a sense of what your organization does, and in case you have any specific questions for all of us, throw them in.
Sure, thanks, Bilal. Hi, Amelie. So the challenge, we basically, I think Bilal gave a good introduction. We digitize document execution. So the challenge in India of selling or pitching legal technology is often that the legal industry and lawyers, and I'm at the risk of generalizing here, are often very technologically averse. So any conversation on adopting a technological solution with a lawyer or someone involved in the legal industry involves the first hoop of actually overcoming that stigma. So I'm just curious to know if you faced any similar such challenge pitching to American lawyers, and how you actually overcame. What are some of the things you did to actually overcome it, or the things you do on a daily basis to overcome such conversations and, you know, get beyond that stigma?
Yeah. Oh man, that is like such a big part of my job. So thanks for sharing it, Aditya. Like definitely, I think the way I think about it is like lawyers are trained to be skeptical, and they need to be, right? That is sort of their job, critical thinking and thinking through tough challenges, and like not accepting that something like technology might come in as an easy fix, right? So I think something that has been helpful for us is continued dialogue and conversation, right? And letting them co-design our product, right? So something else that came out was like, a few attorneys mentioned to us, oh, we don't want this to be an app, because if it's an app, then if people cross the border, people might see that there is information on them and might be held against them as an intention to stay in the US if they're filling out an asylum application, for instance, right? So those are things that we didn't really have the capacity to think about in that same way. So their input was really valuable, and letting them know that we are taking their input and that they have a chance to co-design a product with us, I think was really important. So I think like 80% of our conversations are not like sales conversation, right? They're like, hey, like, what are your needs? How is this going? Tell us what's working. Tell us what's not working. How can we make this better for you? And I think that mindset really helps break down some of those barriers. And it takes a while too, right? The last thing that really helps is actually volunteering and being on the ground, right? I call this like street cred. If you're like there and doing the work, and in my instance, like filling out asylum applications at the border for 14 hours a day, that builds empathy, right? And they feel like you understand them better. So I think putting yourself in their shoes literally can be helpful in order to bridge some of those differences as well. And don't sell technology as a fix to all their problems, right? Just be like, hey, this can help you with this task, and like be really specific in your language with that.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I will take a couple of questions that have come in through the question board. I'll also ask at some point for Sachin to also step in. So just giving you a heads up, Sachin.
Cool.
You know, so one of the questions that's, in fact, a couple of times a question that's been coming again and again is the question of, you know, what's there on paper, the law that's on paper, and the law that's enforced. Now, of course, like you mentioned, you're not just a product, you're also an organization. So, you know, we hope that, you know, you push it till it pops. So what are the various stages in between getting people onboarded and getting to the final result? And how do you navigate those stages?
Yeah. I feel like I'm giving the same answer over and over, right? Like our partners they're really great advocates, and they're really amazing at standing up for rights and holding the government accountable to enforcing them. And a lot of times the government does not actually practice the way they say they do, right? And that is because the government is made out of people, right? Like the government seems like this abstract thing, but it's people who are enforcing it, right? So if, for instance, a client doesn't get a credible fear interview at the border, our partner organization would actually accompany them with a volunteer or an attorney volunteer who then says, hey, this client hasn't received their credible fear interview. We would like to request it now, right? And that sort of advocacy on the ground, you cannot substitute that with technology, right? Like one part is, yes, empowering your clients to understand what's going on and to give them knowledge so they can like defend their own rights to some extent. So education is important, but advocacy cannot be replaced. And yeah, like I said, our partners do that advocacy all the time, right? In the form of lawsuits like the ACLU, but also in the form of like actually on the ground, insisting on having their rights enforced.
So good to hear. I will add one more question from my side. So essentially, I used to be a TV journalist, and My job was to just go out there, get information. At some point, I decided to also get into the civic tech space. And I remember when I was starting, I kind of did not even know the difference between WordPress and what is Python, and what does it even mean. And once you start getting into the product side of things and the conversations begin, that's where you kind of figure out, okay, this is working, this is not working. For me personally, it was a very organic experience. We had to go through various layers, talk to a lot of our users, and then through various stages, we were able to understand that this prototype is working better. This is the user experience they like as compared to the other ones. So that was all a very organic process. Give us a sense of how it was for you. Any tips, any ideas, or maybe some of the things that we may not have to repeat when we start?
Yeah. I think getting like a prototype in front of your attorneys or the people who are going to be using the product is really important. And there are some really great ways to do mock-ups that don't involve building the full product or the full feature. Another thing is to like sort of probe your clients, right? To be like, hey, we're thinking of building this feature. Like, would you want it? Right? Or like, I don't know, those are just some ways to test it before you actually send a developer team to build it, right? So I think that is really helpful. Yeah, that's my only piece of advice. Like, use mock-up software and like take people through a mock-up and see which one they like better, so that you don't have to, because it takes time to build software, right? So don't build out the full stack yet.
Okay, great. Can I request Sachin to jump in if he has any questions to ask or a point to make?
Thank you, Bilal. I would put my video on, but I changed it to my pajamas, so I'm mindful of putting the video on. So let me. So one thing that Amélie, as you were speaking, I always love to know from entrepreneurs is their biggest learning moment so far. Like, has there been a moment where either you've seen that you've been doing something horribly wrong, or you've seen that there's an incredible opportunity in the way that you could go in a certain direction. So if you had to pinpoint a big learning moment for you, I'm sure there are many, but if you had to pinpoint one, which one would it be? And the second thing I want to know is, as you've been doing this, is there a really surprising use case or application of what you've been doing that's been knocking on your door, and you're thinking about whether to go there or not?
Yeah. Wow, there's so many learning moments all the time. I mean, the other week, our attorneys called us and were like, oh, it looks like the data is gone. And we're like, what do you mean? The data is gone? So that was definitely like a moment of panic. So we just like sent our CTO and our developers to like figure it out. But oh my God, luckily the data was not gone, but there was an early instance where we hadn't actually implemented autosave at every question, where we sort of put the burden on the user to save the progress. And it turned out that was a terrible idea. Like, you need to autosave at every question. And we learned that pretty fast through that moment of like, ah, the data is gone. So that was a big like learning moment for us in terms of huge opportunities. I mean, I think like I said, this digital passport sort of came out of people who were saying like, oh my God, I need this for DMV forms, and like I for healthcare, and we're working with like homeless folks who need food stamps, right? So that opportunity of both ensuring like privacy and making those bureaucratic barriers go away or be easier to overcome was really a key moment for us in terms of our like future vision, right? Like going from like, oh, we're solving asylum to we could do this this entire thing and really equip everyone with the power to have their data easily transferable and easy to use and easy to understand was pretty huge for us.
Okay, great. Okay, good. We have a few questions around ADR, alternative dispute resolution processes that could come in this process, questions around arbitration, perhaps making tribunals to make this process more streamlined. I feel those are more policy-related questions. As an advocate, would you maybe support some of these alternatives?
Oof, I'm not an expert on international arbitration, and I have a desire to call on Shalini for this because I think she understands this much better than I do. Yeah, honestly, I'm not qualified.
Yeah, we were just, so somebody who advocates, solution to this crisis, would you say that it becomes easier? Can there be more products or more approaches towards figuring out solutions to that if there are other ways? I'm assuming perhaps yes. Perhaps governments that are more inclined towards finding solutions would also offer alternative means of engagement. That goes without saying. I am waiting for some other people to send me questions in case they have, or I could just quickly go through the ones that are already there. I want to end with a question. We have about 8 minutes for the webinar, so I think I can sneak in 2 questions. So if anybody has any specific one, give me a shout out. Or else I may ask the last one. Shalini, you may want to come in if you have anything.
Sure. Bilal, thanks so much. And Amélie, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. So I will switch the video on, like not in my pajamas, it's the morning. So thank you so much. And one thing I was wondering, just to build off of Sachin's question earlier, about learning moments, the kind of what you wish you'd known then that you know now, in terms of your journey, both in the space specifically, as well as being a young woman legal entrepreneur, what that sort of space has meant for you. So both in terms of policy and context. I was just wondering if you had thoughts on that learning curve that you've had throughout your time.
Yeah, I mean, my background is like deeply in policy and not in entrepreneurship. So I never went to business school. And also, if you had asked me if I would have a legal tech startup, I would have probably thought you had some bad tea that morning, because it was very unlikely for me, I think. But I think the realization that I had was that you just need to, like, again, be attached to your problem, right? And whatever that requires in order to solve is what you should do. And you should really try to understand your stakeholders, which is a very policy thing to say, but talk to the people you're serving and looking to serve, and see how they see the problem, because you might have a very different perspective. In terms of entrepreneurship, like, just don't be scared of it, right? Like, it's really just advanced problem solving, and lawyers are really good at problem solving. So it requires some learning of jargon, like what are KPIs and what is MRR? KPIs, FYI, are key performance indicators, and MRR is monthly recurring revenue, and investors care about things like that. Or are you a B2B company or a B2B2C company, or are you SaaS, right? Like, those are things that you just need to get fluent in. For me, it was like learning another language. The other thing as a female entrepreneur, I think, is speaking with confidence, right? I think I've noticed that sometimes when you ask female identifying people, like, what is your revenue going to be by year 2? They say something like, okay, so these are our key assumptions, and this is our revenue right now. And if we take this assumption and we scale it up 2 years, and then we scale it a little bit down, then this is what we have, right? So, and they try to reason you through it. And I think in the startup world, sometimes they just want you to give an answer. So usually male entrepreneurs, I've noticed, especially white male entrepreneurs, saying something like, I'm confident it's $2 million. And you're like, where did that come from? But that seems to satisfy investors sometimes. So just be willing to change your communication style if necessary, and be willing to get credibility from other people, right? So sometimes I bring my co-founder, sometimes I rely on advisors. So don't be scared to ask for help and support. And yeah, again, your task is to love solving your problem and to love serving the people you serve, and everything else you can learn. So then don't let that scare you.
All right, let me take you to the last question, which was also sent in the Q&A section. What really inspires you to do this work consistently? And who is your ideal? Why do you do what you do?
I mean, my personal KPI is really simple, right? If we can make asylum easier for one person or one family, and protect one family from having to go back to persecution, my job is done, right? Obviously, I would like that to be more than one person, but that's really the metric. We're working with human lives and humans who need help. So if we're able to provide some assistance, then my job is done. And as a policymaker, that outcome is really important. And yeah, I think that inspires me every day. It's like watching our clients have an easier time. It's watching our attorneys representing more clients and doing the work they love more. Like no attorney enjoys filling out forms, right? So if they cannot do that so much, they're generally pretty happy. And what they really thrive at doing is representing their clients. And that really inspires me personally. Who's my ideal? I have so many ideals. My colleagues inspire me constantly. Shalini and I have been working on some projects together. She inspires me all the time. And so do our professors and the people I get to learn from and our advisors. So I don't think I can pinpoint one single ideal person, because I don't think looking up to an ideal is healthy, but looking up to your team, my team is inspiring me, and your colleagues, I think that's the group of people that then drive me forward.
Okay, this was a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here. Thank you so much to everyone for sending us these amazing, very productive questions. Thank you so much to all the other partners who joined us and joined us with these questions. Big thank you from my side for everyone for attending this session. And I'm handing it back to Shannon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bilal. This was really, really excellent. And thank you again, Amélie, for being here. From Agami's side, I just wanted to take a few words just to wrap up today's session. I'm mindful and conscious of time. This has been the first of what we hope will be a series, Bridges for Justice. And as we mentioned at the start, the initiative is aimed at looking at how change makers in different, very different spaces and contexts are addressing similar legal problems. What are their goals and how are they charting these journeys? And we're hoping through this initiative to talk about generative insights. So we hope you've all taken away today thoughts to think of, things to connect with or mull over, and potentially make connections. And also, I think more importantly, how different people respond to similar issues and what it might mean going forward in terms of future directions. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope you'll join us next time. Thank you.
Thank you.